to summarize essentially what you're saying, and correct me if this is not your position, the Masters didn't invent the vowel system, they invented a series of graphic symbols to represent the vowels. Is that fair?
That is probably the easiest way to say it.
Is that the mainstream scholarly view? That's one of my questions.
It depends on which stream of scholarship.
Okay.
In this, in Masoretic studies, yeah, it's fairly accepted that the Tiberians invented a system of points to record a tradition that was older than them.
Okay. What are some other views within scholarship?
Well, you can say that the Tiberians invented the vowels as their own way of interpreting the text, and it is in fact not derived from an earlier tradition.
Okay.
I think there are too many connections between things that we can glean from Greek translations of Hebrew in the Second Temple period and Greek transcriptions of Hebrew, connections between that and then the medieval Tiberian tradition that suggests that they were not just inventing something on the fly.
Okay. Well, that's actually really important. So what would be some sources of those Greek transcriptions that you're talking about?
Well, there's of course the Septuagint, which...
Let's assume my audience doesn't know what the Septuagint is.
So it's the early 1st century BC. I don't know exactly when, but the...
Well, so the original Septuagint is dated to 250 BC,
Okay.
the time of one of the Ptolemaic kings. He was establishing, according to the legend, the library at Alexandria. But that was only the 5 books of Moses. Later, other books were translated.
Right.
Esther is probably the latest one because it has a colophon that, I forget the date, but sometime around 125 BC, let's call it something like that. So sometime between 250 and 125, of course, we don't have that document. We have something from 300 AD in Codex Vaticanus and Indicus and Alexandrinus. So, but it preserves, and then it had been updated throughout over the centuries. That's another problem that we have. But we have fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls that really are, Second Temple period. So we have these Greek transcriptions. And in one of the lectures today, they talked about Greek transcriptions, not just from the Septuagint, but from other sources, which I found fascinating. The Secunda, for example, which is from Origen in the 2nd century CE or AD. And then we have these inscriptions that have transcriptions of words, especially names. Right. So from some of those sources, you can tell the date, or you have connections, you say, rather, to the Tiberian vowel system and the Tiberian pronunciation.
Right, so you can see the way certain things were pronounced however long ago when those Greek transcriptions of Hebrew were made, assuming, and this is the catch, assuming you knew how Greek was pronounced then.
That is an interesting question.
Yeah, and Ben Cantor has worked on that quite a bit. He gave a lecture just earlier today. So you can use those to find some connections between, especially names, because they're transcribed in Greek a certain way, as opposed to translated. They're transcribed from the Hebrew. And also other ways you can find connections between the Tiberian tradition and earlier traditions is comparing earlier biblical books and later biblical books.
Talk about that.
Well, this is not my field of expertise.
Fair enough,
but
in
Aaron
general.
Horncall has done this. He was here today as well, where you can look at the way that the Tiberians decided to vocalize like Nephal versus internal passives, and that can tell you what things were written first or what things were written before, and if they're related to Dead Sea Scrolls based on how the Dead Sea Scrolls were recorded. But it gets very technical, and I don't always follow it, I'll be honest.
Okay, so there's actually distinctions between the way they vocalize things, which means they weren't just making it up on the fly, as you say. Professor Jeffrey Kahn, who is your PhD supervisor, he remarked to me once, he said it's ridiculous that the Tiberians would just sat down and made up vowels for words, that they were recording these pre-existent traditions. And I think he says in his book they go back to Second Temple times.